My name is Ken Bamberger. I'm a professor here at the law school and co-faculty director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies at Berkeley. I want to welcome you warmly to the first in a year-long series of conversations with scholars immersed in the project of shared society in Israel, the future of shared society, shifting lenses. We're going to examine the struggle and the movement and the exercise of shared society as examined from a whole variety of conceptual lenses, including law and gender, civics, education, religion, the arts. Our guests will explore issues of social trust and public policy and current events. There are many shaping the prospects for vibrant shared society and examine both opportunities for and the barriers to building shared society in Israel. This is session one, the future of shared society through the lens of law and gender. I'll note that during this conversation, the Q&A will be open from the beginning, and you should feel free to post any questions you have. Our moderator will integrate them into the discussion and, time permitting, hopefully address them all. This first session is a conversation between Masua Sagiv and Manal Totri-Jubran, moderated by Hadar Aviram. Masua Sagiv is the Koret Visiting Assistant Professor of Jewish and Israel Studies here at UC Berkeley and a scholar in residence of the Shalom Hartman Institute based in San Francisco. Masua's scholarly work focuses on the development of contemporary Judaism in Israel as a culture, a religion, a nationality, and a part of Israel's identity. And her research explores the role of law, state actors, and civil society in promoting social change. Manal Totri-Jubran is an associate professor of the Faculty of Law of the Bar-Ilan University. She received her PhD from the Faculty of Law at Tel Aviv, was a postdoc at the Hebrew University, and has been awarded numerous prizes for her scholarship. She was awarded in 2019 the Gomi Prize by the Israeli Association of Public Law for excellence as a young researcher in public law, and her main fields are law and society, legal geography, multiculturalism, minority rights, and local government. Hadar Aviram is the Thomas E. Miller Class of '73 Professor of Law at UC Hastings and is a leading scholar of law and society, where she specializes in criminal justice, civil rights, law and politics, and social movements. While she received her earlier degrees in law at the Hebrew University, she is a graduate of the JSP program, the Jurisprudence and Social Policy program here at UC Berkeley, where she received her PhD and has written a wide body of amazing scholarship, 3 award-winning books, dozens of articles, and you can find her blog, hadiraviram.com, which covers criminal justice policy here in California. I'll turn the floor over to our 3 guests. Welcome to Berkeley. Thank you so much for being here. Hadar, the floor is yours.
Ken, thank you very much for this gracious introduction, and welcome to my fellow panelists. So I'm assuming that many of the members of our audience are reeling from the results of the American election, many of which we're not aware of yet. But today, because our conversation is about civil society in Israel, I want to talk a little bit about the Israeli election just to introduce what our conversation is going to be about. So this is the composition of the 25th Knesset based on the election from just a few days ago. Let the colors not confuse you to our US-based listeners. Blue is right-wing and red is left-wing. So don't be thrown off by this. After a government that held on kind of quite barely without Benjamin Netanyahu, sort of reeling from 12 years of Benjamin Netanyahu as Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu is back leading the majority of Knesset members and likely our next Prime Minister. We're also seeing an increase in the power of many right-wing parties, including religious Zionism, chaired by Bezalel Smotrich. This is a list that runs openly on a platform of bigotry, on a platform of Jewish supremacy in Israel. And it's quite alarming to see some of these people join the Knesset, possibly as ministers, because of the size of the party, given the fact that just a couple of decades ago, these people were not allowed to run to the Knesset because of their open incitement to racism. You can see the enormous shrink in the size of the left wing. So the Labour Party only holds 4 seats in this government. Meretz, the Civil Rights Party, is completely out of the government, didn't reach the threshold that's necessary to come in. We have 2 parties, including Palestinian members, the Arab Nationalist Party with Mansour Abbas, Ram, with 5 seats, and Hadash Ta'al, chaired by Ayman Odeh, with 5 seats. This is a pretty small body of sort of more lefty or minority-led parties. And this has important implications as to the civil society in Israel, both through the lens of gender and through many other lenses. And that's what we hope to talk about today. So here are some of the things we're planning to cover today. We'll talk a little bit about the election. What's the background to this picture of the Knesset that we're seeing? Where does it come from? What does it have to do with polarization in Israel society, with the occupation, with the rise of very particular forms of religion in Israel? What does it have to do with struggles involving gender, involving class, involving ethnicity, involving the conflict? What sort of barriers exists now to stretch to shared society, talking about citizenship, identity, talking about how this is going to play out in the context of the rule of law and in the context of law enforcement? And what are the potential possibilities for critique, for protest, for free speech under this kind of government? And then we'll talk about some pragmatic next steps. So what's going to happen next? What kind of coalitions is this going to yield, both in terms of people who support this government and people who oppose it? And what role would litigation and the Israel Supreme Court play in this scenario? So that is the plan for our conversation. So let me start by invite our panelists to opine on the extent to which the election is a turning point in Israeli history or a continuation of existing processes. Should I call on people? Manal, do you want to get started?
Yes, I can get started if it's okay with Masua. Good morning, everyone. Good evening for those of you who are joining us from where I come from Israel, from Haifa. For me, it's a continuous process. This is why I'm not that shocked and not that depressed as Masua and others will present in a minute. I've been feeling the decline in Israel's democracy and a commitment to liberalism, to equality, and to pluralism quite a while now, as a Palestinian woman that is living in Israel. And I'm kind of living in some sort of a very nice a place where it's very tolerant. Haifa is a mixed city. I was born in a mixed neighborhood. I used to buy my bread in Hebrew when I was 5 years old. So I grew up in a city that was very tolerant and has become in the last 10 or even 20 years, for 2 decades, I've been literally feeling a decline in the amount of tolerance that people have for listening Arabic, for just knowing that their neighbor is not a Jew. So, but I think that the breaking point is what Hadar said before. It's the minute that convicted felonies, such as Ben-Gvir and mainly Ben-Gvir, has entered into the Israeli parliament. It's not, the breaking point was not now, the breaking point was 18 months ago when he first became a member of the Knesset. And I think that this was a real mark of the beginning of the end, because extremists and racism have been is part of every society, actually. Not only, it's not something that is unique to Israel. We have extremists everywhere. But I think that the main problem here is the minute that they become part of the parliament, then they have a legitimacy, they have a voice that in the public sphere. They can be elected and they can decide on very fatal issues such as the Supreme Court's power and so on. And this is, I think, what is the breaking point. It's a kind of a process. I'm not so surprised, but the problem that had to light a red light for everyone should have been a while ago, where the peak is not this elections, but rather 18 months ago, in the minute that Ben-Gvir has become a member of the Knesset.
Masua, same question to you. What are you seeing in this process?
So I hear what Manal, I hear what you're saying, but for me, I would say it's both a turning point and a continuation. It is a continuation in the sense of, in the state of Israel, there is a conflation between Israeliness and Jewishness, meaning for the vast majority of Israeli Jews, to be an Israeli is to be Jewish, and to be Jewish is to be an Israeli. There's plenty of consequences to these dual statements, but what I think is important for us right now is the fact that there is no place in Israeli society for non-Jews. There is no conceptual thick identity or shared story for Israelis that are not Jews. So the conflation of Jewishness and Israeliness is something that is definitely a continuing, I would say, almost from the beginning of the state and even before that. There are different ideas such as mamlachtiyut that are trying to do something different of inclusiveness, but it never garnered enough support to be mainstream and to be consensual. So this is definitely a continuation. There is no room for a non-Jewish identity, not a Palestinian identity, not an Israeli identity. That's a continuation. But there's also, I do think there's a turning point, and the turning point is the growing power of the racist party and agents in Israeli politics. Now, the fact that Ben-Gvir's party got 15 seats out of 120, I think, even if it's not surprising, it should be, we should stop. We should stop and say something is growingly disturbing in what's happening here. Maybe just to emphasize 2 points about that, though. One is that this is a part of a global trend of the rise of extremism and racism, and the extreme right is rising throughout the world. That's one, even though the elections, the American elections yesterday the day before yesterday are so interesting in this respect, because there's a pushback in this trend, I think, in America, which is very interesting. And the second is that I do want us to separate between the politicians and their voters. I don't think that all of a sudden from 6 seats to 8 seats to 14 or 15 seats, 300,000 Israelis all of a sudden became extreme racists. I don't think that's the case. I do think that a lot of them feel as if Ben-Gvir changed. I don't believe that, but I think a lot of people believe that. And I also think there are different motivations for voting for him, even if I wholeheartedly disagree with it. So I think it's a continuation, it's a turning point, but we need to understand the circumstances in order to try to think of moving forward.
Hadar, can I just compliment in one comment? When you introduced in your presentation the results of the elections, there's another very important element that also I think that gave rise to Ben-Gvir is that in the last year, for the first time since the establishment of the state, an Arab party was part. An Arab party was part of the government. So the elections, I think, had two very important statements. First one is we, the Israeli society, or most of the people who voted to the right-wing parties, are stating we do not want any Arab parties within our government. We do not want any Arab members of the Knesset. We can hardly tolerate them as members of the Knesset, but this is the borderline. We do not want them to make any decisions for us, although there are plenty of social enactments that were and legislations that were enacted and were proposal of the members of the Arab parties. But still, I think that there is a very clear statement. We are not ready yet for them to be part of our decision-making process. This is one issue. The other issue is you mentioned before that Meretz was erased, was totally erased. So Meretz, it was like in a minute it could have been part of the Knesset, but I think this is another statement that we do not want to hear anymore about occupation. And this is part of the story. Meretz is I think the only Jewish Zionist party that kept on putting the occupation issue, which is part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's not another issue, it's the main issue. And most of the Israelis just declared we don't want to hear any more about occupation. And this is also a very bad sign, together with the rise of racism and so on.
Can I just add to that? I think this is part of the reason it was so heartbreaking, this result of the election, because we had a year with that at least was the start of a modeling of how it could be a real participation of all sectors, or most sectors, because we should say that not all sectors were represented in the last government, in the outgoing government, and that's maybe part of the problem. But the reason it's so heartbreaking is because we had a start there, and the division with the outgoing government and this forming government is not a division of right and left, because there are most of Israel right now is right-winged, and but you would see conservative, religious, right-wing Jews that are willing to cooperate, even with vast disagreements, with Arab Palestinians leaders. So that's one. The second thing that we shouldn't forget is that because of different technical rules of the game, we see that there is a clear victory of the bloc that is going to form the government. But the fact is that there is only the gap between the two blocs is only a few thousand votes. And I'm not sure that most of the Israeli voters really declared that they're not ready for the partnership, the Jewish-Arab partnership in leadership. I think that who won is not ready for it. That's true. I don't know if it's the clear majority. And the only, and just the last thing that I'd say, as a response to what you said about Meretz, Manal, I think you're completely correct. There is a tendency inside Jewish Israeli society it's a demand from Arab Palestinians who are citizens of Israel to declare themselves as part of Israel, even though they don't get the place in Israel, and not as part of the Palestinian people outside of Israel who are not citizens of Israel. And this is such an unfair demand that, again, it's just infuriating. So yes, the Meretz is a tragedy in this sense also.
So going off of that, there's the sense that there's some breach in the idea of who gets to belong, like, right, who gets to share in the citizenship pie in Israel. And I know both of you do work on this. Masua, you mentioned earlier a term that many of our viewers might not be familiar with, mamlachtiyut, which means something like statelyhood, kind of like this idea that there is at least some collective, or there is something that we all share. And of course, opinions differ over whether that's eroded or whether it never really was, or whether both of these things are true at the same time. I'd like to invite both of you to talk a little bit about this idea of citizenship and belonging, in the sense, for example, of things like the things that Manal studies, which are inclusion through language, through the use of the Arabic language as one of the official languages of Israel. What does this mean about family? What does this mean about inclusive or non-inclusive citizenship? Manal, do you want to start us on that?
Yeah. Well, this is kind of a continuation of the last last point that Masua talked about. I've been teaching in Israel at Bar-Ilan University for 8 years now, a course called Multiculturalism and Minority Rights. And I have a special lesson about identity and about community. And all my students nod when I talk about recognition and misrecognition and how people identify themselves as part of a community and so on. But the minute that I identify myself or I present myself as a Palestinian Israeli woman, they get into a shock, and they cannot handle these two terms in one sentence, okay? And it's very important for me here to clarify, to try, I can't clarify, but rather to point to the complexity of these two identities, because I'm part of the Palestinian people. I share the same history. I share the same pain in all sorts of marking events, starting from the Nakba, from the 48 after the establishment of Israel, other historical events, October 2000, and so on. I have the same language, I have the same accents, I share the same kind of food that is different from the Lebanese Arabic food, and so on. But I also, I am very much Israeli. It's not, and I'm not Israeli because I have an Israeli passport. I see Eretz Nehederet, which is a comedian show about the Israeli people. I also hear some Hebrew music as well as Arabic and English music. I have Israeli friends, Jewish Israeli friends, but that I deeply connect with them in all sorts of issues and all sorts of levels of identity. But at the same, so I can understand how people find it very difficult to comprehend this complexity of identity, but I never claimed that it is a simple identity. In the Palestinian people who live in the occupied territories, they know that they are Palestinians, full stop. Masua knows that she is Jewish Israeli, full stop. My identity is much more complex. And if I add also my religious identity, I'm a very secular person, but still culturally, I'm very Christian. Like I celebrate Christmas, obviously I have a tree in Christmas, and so on. And so I'm also a minority inside a minority, because The Christians within the Arab population constitute only 10% of the whole Arab population. The Muslim population in Israel is 80%. From the Arab population, 10% are Christians and 10% are Druze. And so it's a really complex, and I find it very challenging sometimes to confront and to deal with this complexity, but this is part of who I am. I'm not going to
give up.
To give up. Sorry, it's the time. I'm not going to. I can't give up any part of this identity. However, as Masua said, I don't feel that someone is that most of, especially the young generation, the young Israeli Jewish generation, have a very hard time accepting the Palestinian aspect of my identity. Although at the same time they keep talking about the Arabs as a kind of a danger within Israel. So in their set of mind, they totally see me as a Palestinian, but they have a hard time hearing me identify myself as a Palestinian. So this complexity goes along with us all the time.
No, I think one of the tragedies of our, sorry, Hadar. I think that one of the tragedies of our times is being led by fear. And I'll start by saying, I think there is a reason for fear by a lot of Israeli Jews. The violence in May 2021 was devastating. The violence in mixed cities. I have family and friends who were afraid to leave their house. I know that Manal also has similar experiences. And I think that many of our politicians are playing very well on the card of fear. But I do want to state something about the structure of our, I don't know, model of Israeli society, which I think really responds, Manal, to what you described. We are priding ourselves on being a Jewish and democratic state. And I'm saying, I don't want us to stop being Israel. I don't want Israel to stop being a Jewish and democratic state. But the problem is that Judaism and democracy are inherently unbalanced because the Jewish side has a thick identity of shared values and shared story, whereas the democratic part of the equation only means a thin, neutral version of equal political rights. It's great that all of us as individuals, that Manal and I have equal political rights. That's great. But Israel also recognized my story. My story is the Jewish story, and Israel recognizes it. But Israel does not recognize Manal's story and others' stories as well. Now, you know, I'm a religious feminist Jew. I'm religious, and I'm also a feminist. For many years, both religious people and feminist people would tell me it's impossible, it's too complex, they are conflicting. But you know what? We are complex people, as Manal just said. We can have complex identities, and it doesn't necessarily threaten our particular identity to have another particular identity. The question is how we navigate them. Right now, the model of society that we have in Israel is not enough. Mamlachtiyut, or this sense of political statism, is supposed to create an inclusiveness that will allow Israeliness to be thick. That's not the case right now. Israeliness is not thick right now. It's at best Jewishness plus. That's not how it should be.
So since we've started digging into the issue of complex identities, and I just want to say I'm seeing a lot of questions in the audience from people who have really deep electoral concerns about how this government is going to work, if at all. What's the role of this? I do want to get to these electoral and rule of law questions, but since we're in a conversation about identity, I did want to bring up the lens of gender, which is what we were invited to talk about, and this has to do precisely with this intersectional issue that both of you raised. Over the years, people have pointed out the increasing marginalization of women throughout all sectors of Israeli society. But different women encounter different challenges in Israeli society. I mean, just two things that I can think of from the last few years. One of them, for example, is the struggle of the women of the wall to pray near the Wailing Wall and conflicts between them and Orthodox women about what it means to be a Jewish religious woman in Israel and what forms of Jewish worship are acceptable. And I'm thinking, for example, of women who are victimized and challenged by domestic violence within Palestinian society, and the tensions of wanting to get help to people that are on the receiving end of truly terrifying crime, and on the other hand, the need to really be concerned about over-policing and what that does in Palestinian cities and villages. So if I can hear a little bit from both of you about these conflicts of what it means to be all kinds of different kinds of women in Israel. And just kind of to point out for our audience, we're not here as these kind of cardboard figures of like to represent particular sectors in Israeli society. We're all thinkers and public intellectuals, and I mean, each of us comes at it from a different place. So I'm not inviting you to kind of like be the ambassadors of one group or another, but rather to talk about what these complexities look like in contemporary Israeli politics. Masua, do you want to start?
Sure. So there are, as you said, Hadar, there are many issues in which women can be that Israeli patriarchy, if we want to call that way, is cross religion and is cross ethnicity. If we're talking about instances of marriage and divorce, which are controlled solely according to religious law, whichever religious law is applied. If we're talking about the struggle against sexual harm and sexual assaults. These issues cross identity lines. But as opposed to the United States, for example, where there is conversation around the woman vote, the women vote, the women voters, there's a clear division in Israel between women according to ethnic identities and according to religious identities. There is a clear division. Women tend to prioritize their ethnic or religious or national identity higher than their gender identity, even when they are complete activists, when they are feminist activists. I will say that I think, and for that, the key is to form coalitions around issues. I will say that I'm seeing more and more such coalitions that are being built. If we're talking about, if we'll have a chance to talk about dynamics of social change. So this is, I see initiatives that are bottom up. I see more and more coalitions forming around matters of religious marriage and divorce. I see more and more coalitions forming around matters of Me Too or sexual or sexual assaults. And I see now, after the elections, new coalitions forming around women representation, because the forming coalition is gonna have a low of 9 women in the future coalition, as opposed to 31 in the outgoing one. So a representation of women in leadership and in politics is also something that I think we could cooperate on. It means, in a way, embracing a conflict, understanding that we won't solve the disagreements between us. We won't solve the national conflict between us. We won't solve the religious conflict between us, but we can come together on matters that are important to all of us, And this is something that was more the idea that we can cooperate across divides is losing traction around the world. I know that, but I think that I do see more coalitions that are forming on the ground in reality.
Oh, one of the most, you left out one of the very important women movement, Women for Peace.
Yes.
Women and Jewish and Arab and Palestinian women from Israel and from outside, from the occupied territories, an amazing movement of women in black.
You're right.
We had a couple of war in the last 3-4 decades. So we see a very impressive coalition of women, not only in social issues, but coming from bottom up, but also on the political level of the conflict, dealing with the conflict. Well, I try to think about your question, Hadar. I think that if we apply what Masua said about, on the Palestinian women, we just have to double everything, okay? Because the Palestinian women are also women and are discriminated, are in inferior in a double sense. In my work, I would say that I'm really interested in the conflict or the issue of minorities within minorities, and the role of the Jewish state and the responsibility of the state, which is a Jewish state, to provide protection, liberal protection for minorities within minorities. And this apply for women, this apply on the LGBT community and so on. And now there's it's a very, again, it's all complex, right? It's a really complex situation because, I just I finished writing an article about it, and I'm actually too scared from the Palestinian response rather than the Israeli response, because for many years we have been taught that the state wants to look at us as not as a national minority, but as religious minorities that are divided by religion and so on, and that we do not want the Jewish state, not the Israeli state, the Jewish state to interfere in our issues. But I think that for many years the government was in a kind of a convenient place. You don't want us, fine, that's fine with us, it's even more convenient, we will stay out. But actually what I'm trying to do, and it's really risky, is try to invite the state to go in again. I do think that there should be civil family law and not religious law, something that would be enacted by the state and enforced by the state. The whole issue of honor killing, for example, within the Arab community, and Arab crime in the Arab community. So on the one hand, I demand responsibility from the state. On the other hand, this is the same state, this is the same enforcement system, the same police, right? The same state attorney that apply over policing over the Palestinian population. So it's a really very difficult dilemma. And I think that we have to do it very carefully and to think about a cooperation with leaders from the Arab society, but especially also women leaders from the Arab society, not only men leaders, because we tend to, most of the leaders even if we talk about the members of the Knesset, most of them are men, even in the Palestinian parties. But in order to make a change, I'm not sure that the change can be done only within the society or only outside the society, but rather two ways. But now, again, the Palestinian population are very skeptical and very suspicious about, for good reasons, right? For a very problematic history. They are very suspicious about the state's intentions. So I might be too optimistic that this is something that should happen, but I think that there should be also a twist on the way that the state regards and behave towards the Palestinian citizens. And there's and just only one sentence that I think that also it relates to something that you said before about fear. When I say the word Nakba, and so most of the Jewish Israeli who are not familiar of the Nakba and so on, they just get terrified of the word, because this associates to them the end of Israel and sending all the Jews to the sea and so on. This is not it. This is totally not it. There is another reality, another side of the story when Israel was established, and this is part of my story that does not reflect anything about Israel's existence nowadays. Okay, so but because people are motivated from fear, it's very hard. It's very easy to motivate people around fear, because people get scared very easily. So there should be a twist, a shift from the state towards the Palestinian citizens of Israel in a more inclusive shift that regards them as legitimate citizens. We are here to stay for now. We're here to stay, and we do want to be part of the state. And we have a history. We have a story to tell, and it's fine. And it's fine. So, in order for all of this to work, and especially in order to have a social and economic mobility for women, all women in Israel, and specifically minority women, we have to have a shift in this approach, both by the state and eventually also by the population itself.
I think it sounds like, I'm sorry, Hadar, just one sentence. It sounds like talking about truth committees and acknowledging injustices that were done in the past. Can I just ask you one question, Manal, about what you said about you expect the state to go back in and treat these things? Would you want? Who do you think should call and demand the state? Do you think that a coalition and a Palestinian Jewish coalition, or this should be only Arab Palestinians, Israeli Arab Palestinians that are demanding the state to get involved?
Well, I'm a total minority in that, right? I might be the only voice for that, and I still think it's too early to do it. But on the long run, I don't think that we should behave as a separate society. I don't think that the state should sit aside and just let it be. There's two aspects and there's two implications of the situation. One is that we do not have any solidarity and any part of the sense of belonging to the state, to citizenship, to the statehood citizenship. And the second thing is that this is what happened during the last 2 decades. when the state stepped aside, a lot of crime went crazy within the Arab villages because we do not have any enforcement system. And then we have all the sulha. Sulha is in English. Can you help me with that? Some sort of
It's a reconciliation process. It's a process of bringing together people from a conflict and resolving the conflict together.
yes,
letting
A traditional
but-
one, though.
yeah, but it's a communal kind of mediation, and most of the leaders of the Arab Sulha are former convicted felonies, and they were criminals themselves. They're only men. They have there is no sense of justice in controlling the process and so on. And so instead of having, well, I don't have any choice. I do have to hang on the democratic part of Israel, trying to strengthen and emphasizing the democratic aspect of Israel, and invite the state again, invite the state to invite the state back in, again, under the condition that there is a shift in the state's attitude towards the Palestinian minority, and this would also result eventually also in less over-policing, and it would result in a situation that my son, when he's 10 years, my youngest boy is 10 years old, when he see a police car, he gets scared, where the police should kind of, in a correct word, protect us. But I think that this is very, very troubling. It's not going to happen tomorrow or even in the coming 5 years. I think that it would be a process, but this is something that has to be done.
So I have a cluster of questions speaking about sort of law enforcement and the rule of law. Again, I'm seeing that there are lots of pressing electoral questions. I'm going to try to get to as many of them as I can. And this one has to do with the rule of law in Israel in general. So kind of like, where is the Supreme Court in all of this? First of all, is there something that the courts can do to prevent people who are essentially convicted felons of incitement to racism from joining the government? What is going to happen to Netanyahu's many corruption cases? Are they dead in the water at this point? And is there an erosion, generally speaking, in the rule of law, in the sense that we're seeing younger people voting for parties that erode the rule of law in growing numbers? This is, I should say, for our American viewers and listeners, in some ways the inverse process of what we're seeing in the United States, where there's this hope that the Democratic Party, or that, more progressive people have, that, young people are going to vote more progressive, whereas in Israel we're seeing things going the other way around. What does that tell us about the future of the rule of law? What does that tell us about the role that litigation is going to play from now on? Who wants to get us started? Manal, do you want to get us started? Oh, Masua, go ahead.
No, it's fine.
I have a really short answer. It's very difficult for me to seriously address a question about the rule of law when the Supreme Court is part of a legal system that eventually have very little judicial criticism about the occupation and what's happening beyond the green, well, how we call it, the green line after the.
Yes, this is, we're talking about the line from before the 6-Day War, so the line that divides between what Israel looked like before and after the 6-Day War, including the territory that we now think of as Palestine.
Well, I have been for years discussing and thinking and kind of lobbying that there are two kind of Israel, one within the green line and one out of the green line, but I came to the conclusion that we cannot do that anymore. We cannot talk about a liberal state that in some cases the Supreme Court do promote equality that is not enacted within our basic laws, which is kind of the human rights constitution in Israel. And at the same time, we have different rulings regarding the rights of Palestinians in the occupied territories. So I'm having a really hard time convincing myself that there is a rule of law in the first place in Israel. So my answer is really short. I'll give Masua the time to react.
I have three directions of thoughts that may not be coherent with one another. So I'm sorry about that. First, starting with what Manal just said. When we work on change within society, we have generally two approaches. The one is the evolution of society that we think is unjust or not perfect or really horrible. And the second is revolution and radical solutions to change and to completely replace the existing social order or legal order or religious order. Depends on what's the issue that you're talking about. I don't know if I agree. I'm not sure I agree with all of your criticism. And what I do know that even when I have criticism on the legal system and on the Supreme Court, I don't know whether we have a lot of choices other than to try to change it evolutionary. Having said that, I do acknowledge that there are some times where working from within only legitimizes a structure that it can be inherently unjust. I don't have the right answer as to when do we know that something is not legitimate anymore and we have to stop working from within. I know that that right now in this government, I am at least pausing before I'm thinking of participating, which is my deeply held belief about social change. I am an evolutionist in my core. That's one thought. The second thought is, I think, while not blaming the left and liberalism for this global and specifically in Israel trend, I do think that we have a responsibility of burning the court. We have burned the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. We have a tendency, when I say we, I'm talking about liberal civil society. Liberal civil society has a tendency to go to court for everything. And I think that the court was not careful enough. And I do think that people in the bloc that is now forming the government believe that there is a democratic deficiency in how the court acted all these years. And courts live by, specifically high courts live based on the trust of the people. And there is no trust in the people of our courts, and part of that is justified, or I would argue that part of that is justified. And I think that the last point that I want to really carefully say about Netanyahu's trial, a lot of what we're seeing right now with the anti-liberal forces started with Netanyahu's prosecution. I am all for rule of law and the legal system. I am completely against corruption. I would say that I have heard voices in the liberal camp, even in the liberal legal camp, asking if we are in a very troubling situation right now, if we don't have the choice between good and bad, but between bad and worse, should we consider choosing living with corruption in order to fight anti-liberalism? I don't have an answer for that. I think it is tragic that I am even raising this point, but I think this is something that is existent in liberal legal circles in Israel. So that's why I'm airing it in here.
So bringing this
I just have one sentence about Netanyahu's trial. I'm not sure that it would be ended or something like that. Netanyahu is really anxious about the international response. This is why he's trying to do everything right with Ben Gvir now and so on. So I'm not sure that he would hurry on and stop his trial or something, or he would not do something very upfront. If something happens with his trial, it would be something under the surface. He is a really, really clever person. He won't do that.
So sort of piggybacking on the issue of the trial, I'm seeing people asking us a lot of questions about where does the left go from here? Sort of questions about, maybe making this trial sort of front and center of the opposition to Netanyahu, and in many ways the flipping of the government in the previous short-lived government, based on the fact that the idea that he is deeply corrupt was something that you could bring a lot of people from the center left in Israel together, even though not all of them agreed about very fundamental issues like ending the occupation and many other things that are huge. But there was this sense that we're all kind of being, a captive audience we can't let go of kind of like this immense corruption that's filtered into pretty much everywhere, infiltrated everywhere. So if not that, then what is the role of the opposition now, and where does the opposition have room to work? So one question that somebody asked, I want to phrase it exactly the way that our audience member did. Does anyone from the left center or center left see a way to keep egos and ideological positions from relegating their parties to oblivion, as happened in the recent election? And in that respect, what happens to protests from now on? What happens to free speech? If not litigation, if there are challenges with using the Supreme Court, then what other avenues are open? Is there any political hope to sort of re-energize the left? Where does this whole side of the Israeli map go from here?
I think that I'm part of a WhatsApp group of legal scholars, and they are in panic. Huge panic, like the sky has fallen. I think that first of all, it's very mistaken to talk about left central. There is no left anymore in Israel. There hasn't been any left in Israel for quite a while, except of merits, which and now it's gone. Unfortunately, I hope that they would not disappear and would try again in the next elections. But even the the Labour Party are not really left wing; they are more central wing. And if we take the and other parties' Gantz, I'm not sure that he's left at all or he's central at all. So the terminology here is very mistaken, I think. And economically wise, most of them are very right-wing oriented. I'll just share with you something that I decided just today when we talk about where do we go from here, right? This is the kind of the question. What do people will go from here? And so these legal scholars are in great panic, and they want to have a protest and to sign all the names of the scholars. And I'm thinking, seriously, now you think that everything has fallen down, and from this point and forward, we have to now work on the democracy. It's kind of too little, too late. And I'm talking again as a Palestinian. I think that Masua would give you a really different answer, but I feel kind of, and this is, I'm talking from my heart, I can't feel that I'm part of this war or this conflict anymore. I can't feel any sense of belonging, because people for many years have lived very good with occupation, with discrimination, with exclusion. And suddenly, when these very right extremist wings that are talking about violation of women's rights, about violation of LGBT rights, suddenly the democratic system is under threat, where there is human rights violations daily in the occupied territories and inside Israel. Where have you been? Like, why should I be part of this this fight? I'm really, this is my personal thinking, and I don't feel any, and this is very saddening for me. I don't feel any attachment to this fight. I feel that it's the Jewish people's fight for what Ben-Gurion established 4 years ago, a Jewish, democratic, secular. Ben-Gurion really wanted a secular state, actually, and this is collapsing slowly, but they are seeing it as like a process of collapsing, of democratic collapsing. And well, this is not my fight.
I'm hearing everything that you're saying, and I just want to emphasize that by what I'm going to say, I'm not challenging any of your statements or feelings. I don't know what to do with helplessness. I don't deal well with helplessness. Because I mean, to sit helpless is, and this is not, let me say it again, this is not a response to you, Manal. This is a response to Hadar's question. So one of the things, just to say what we are talking about, one of the red flags that we're talking about is talk about an override clause, which is a constitutional mechanism that the forming government is talking about, that says whatever the court decides, we can override by a law with a different majority. Now they're talking about 61 out of 120. There are different formulas for this override, but essentially what that means is, if the court says you cannot infringe minority rights, we, the politicians, say we can actually infringe minority rights. Now, I truly understand what Manal says. Manal says, well, up until now, you didn't have, other than one law, you didn't have an override clause, and you still infringed upon minority rights, and the court didn't do anything. I hear that. I do want to say, though, that I don't see another option than continuing. I mean, considering the fact, I mean, I'm an Israeli, I see my future in Israel, I see my children's future in Israel. So I don't have the privilege of saying I'm not going to fight. The question is strategically, what do you do? So first, what's very clear to me is that the left and the center left failed in persuading the Israeli public. We deem democracy as the least worst systems of governing. Democracy is based on the people, and the people are not convinced by left and center and liberal ideas. I want to bracket that by saying that right and left, as Manal said, is so confusing because Ben Gvir is economically left, for example. He's pro-socialist ideas, whereas you'll see in the labor party some economically right ideas being promoted. So this is all mixed up right now. The regulating idea that really influences election in Israel is one, security. Two, I would say religion or religious identity, national identity, something like that. Economy, I think, is third right now. And that's a clear contradiction to what's happening in the United States, for example. So one, persuasion. We have to persuade better. I know that some legal scholars right now are saying, I'm not going to participate in this discussion at all because this is legitimizing the whole discussion of an override clause and of constitutional deficiency. I don't know if I don't know what to say about that. I understand that. I don't know if it's a good solution to moving forward unless you say, well, enough, I'm out. I'm not saying I'm out. Two, I think that we need to participate realistically in specific struggles. So yes, struggles regarding gender equality, struggles regarding Arab-Palestinian Jewish partnership and cooperation in Israel, specific issues regarding the legal system and rule of law, definitely. And with all this, being very realistic and knowing that we'll probably only have small successes in the short term, and with this continue to hold the dream or the vision of how Israel really should be, how Israel really should look like. What would be continuing to write and to teach and to speak about, the right legal vision and structure, the just, inclusive Israeliness. I mean, not give up on those, even though it may seem so far-fetched right now.
Well, can I just add a sentence on Musawa's last point? Well, what you're saying is education, right? And I totally agree with you. I think that we have to start bottom up from the education system. The problem is that Ben-Gvir is also demanding the education ministry. So I do think that our future depends on our children's choices. And this is education, and well, I really don't know how can we fight a racist education ministry. So, but this is the place to start, and this is their place to start as well.
So this brings me to another issue that people have mentioned in the Q&A. So several of our viewers are, I think, understandably puzzled by the fact that the youth vote in Israel doesn't follow the rules of the youth vote. I'm talking about the Jewish youth vote in Israel. Doesn't follow the kind of like the paradigm of the way people think here that the youth is going to increasingly vote in elections. And so we started talking about the educational system and kind of like the siloing of the educational system, or who takes domain over the educational system. This goes back to the concept that Masua brought up earlier of statehood, mamlachtiyut, of kind of like how much of education is shared and how much of it is just, disparate ideologies that people get. Many of our viewers probably don't know that for the most part, Jewish and non-Jewish children do not go to school together. In Israel, and for the most part, religious and secular Jewish kids do not go to school together, and that's beyond kind of like just multiple, private, schools. Although even the public school system is pretty siloed ethnically in Israel. So is this part of what's going on, or is part of what's going on that young people get exposed to military service, which pushes everybody's opinions a little bit to the right at a young age, or what can explain kind of like the concerns of youth, the way that they manifest in basically the proof is in this right-wing pudding that we have here?
I think this is so interesting that we are talking about this, and I am sitting in Berkeley Berkeley University, and everything that happened in Berkeley Law School with the student organizations. I think we are in a period of time where complexities and nuances are not part of public discourse, and this is specifically true for young ages, for Generation Z. When I teach about Israel here, and when I taught students in Israel, I saw a lot of stigmas and talking with in vast how do you call it, like broad brushed about everything basically. So part of it, I think, is the age, and our views are complexified as we grow older, and part of it is the time is the period in time that we are at. I'll just mention one program that I led when I directed the Menomadin Center for Jewish and Democratic Law at Bar-Ilan University, where Manal is a professor, and the program is still going. We had a program for high school kids as part of their civic education, where although there are 4 streams of education, we had 3 of them without the ultra-Orthodox that declined participation. So we had religious Jews, secular Jews, and Arab Palestinians coming to the university and sitting with the law students that we taught, that we trained, to talk about questions of identity and law and Jewish and Judaism, democracy. And what was interesting is that this program, which is expanding from year to year, we don't have enough. I know that right now in Bar-Ilan, there is so much, there's not enough room to accommodate all of the schools that want to participate. And what's interesting is that this program is recognized by the Ministry of Education. So there might be, I agree that the politicians that hold the ministries are important, but there is also something in the mid-level of the people in the different ministries that I think that we can work with. I think that such programs are extremely important, and they hold a tremendous meaning for the Israeli future.
Manal?
Yes, I have to mention here the bilingual schools in Israel that started about more than 15 years ago. It's a bottom-up. As what you presented is accurate, but starting from 2005, about 2005, we started seeing a bottom-up movement of Jewish and Arab families that established bilingual educational institutions, schools, and kindergartens. These are totally bilingual. Students are taught in Hebrew and in Arabic. They celebrate both the Jewish and the Muslim and the Christian holidays and so on. And this is still a private a project and not a governmental project. So we do see, I think that we do see very small, but still we do see some sort of bottom-up educational togetherness and pluralism and so on. But you asked before something that I want to address. What do young Arab Palestinian think, vote, what happens with them? So the Palestinian population in Israel have moved through through different phases. And I think that today's voters who are 18, 19, 20 are very democratic in a sense that if I compare them to the first generation who lived under the military ruling after the establishment of the state, who were very scared, who didn't say what they think about and what they had in mind and so on. Palestinian young people today know that they have rights. They want to practice their citizenship. They want to practice their legal rights. They don't thank the state for giving them any privileges and so on. They know that they have a right, and this is what they're going to do. They are more proud of their Palestinian identity. So
You're muted, Manal, all of a sudden.
sorry. But still there is mixed feelings, but because there is also a great disappointment in the political leaders of the Arab parties. And some have very harsh criticism towards the Turam, which is the Arab party that entered the government last year. I thought that this was a brilliant move personally, but one of its implications was that people have voted to extremists, I think, because they did not like this move. But I think I would like Arab parties to be part of the government. I don't want to be on the opposition anymore. I want to be part of the government. I want to take a lead. I want to decide upon my fate, and I'm very much aware about the problematic and the complexity of being part of a government that is also an occupation government, an occupation state. But as I said before, at the beginning of our talk, everything is complex. So
we have time for one more question, and I've gotten two really rich questions from our organizers. I'm going to try to bring them together, and you can answer what every part of it the two of you think you have something to say about. One of them has to do with the fact that if the old left institutions have collapsed, is there a possibility for new forms and new coalitions to arise? I think Masua started talking a little bit about the idea of coalitions of women and ideas like that, and Manal mentioned coalitions of women for peace and women in Black. And the other one has to do with this siloing. Maybe that happens on the state or on the individual level, but what happens in the interface between communities? Are communities siloed as well, or are there possibilities for communities to interact? Now, I'm going to share a little secret, viewers, which is that when we prepared for this panel, the word hope came up. And I know that our panelists don't like the word hope, and it's difficult to talk about hope looking at this map, but I think they did like the idea of just pragmatically, we have to think about where we're going. So many maybe thinking about kind of like what new forms of cooperation, of interaction, of shared interests can emerge from this picture as our sort of last exchange.
Well, this might sound a cliche, but after a bad day, there's always a good day. So it seems like it has to get really, really bad for it to get better afterwards. What I see and what I feel from the fields, from people all around me, even people that I don't know, but they don't know me and I don't know them, but they know that I'm an Arab. They bother to tell me that they are very troubled. The situation is very bad. We have to think what we're going to do. So I think that one good thing is coming out of these elections is that even if it's a process and so on, it shakes people, especially Jewish democratic liberals. It shook them from the essence. They're feeling that something is they're losing something very precious to them. And I think that this breaking point might bring to a more serious, more well more organized activities, more organized coalitions. I think that this would motivate a much more clear and assertive activities towards kind of retaining democracy and the rule of law and everything that people feel that they lost in this election. So this might be a waking call that would drive people very hard to maintain whatever is left and to bring back democracy, liberalism, equality, and so on.
I think we started this conversation with talking about continuation or a turning point. And I said this is a continuation of the conflation of Israeli and Jewish, but I also think there is another process that is going through, that the Israeli society is going through. And this process is a process of more and more integration, of more and more people from different sectors knowing each other. The backlash, the violence of May 2021 and the election results, I think is also both of them are a backlash of this process of increasing Israeliness. And the challenge that we have, if answering to your question, Hadar, the challenge is mobilizing this process into political, in translating this into political movements. Right now, we only see it in civil movements and throughout society. And what we need is to turn this into a political movement of an inclusive, of togetherness political movement. And I'll just end with, let me not use the word hope, but let me use the word dream. I think that even when we have a lot of challenges, and when we feel beaten, it is crucial that we continue dreaming on our vision. And we just had the day of commemoration of Prime Minister Rabin's murder. And in the famous song for Peace, it says, and I'm going to translate it really badly, but bring the dream. I mean, make the dream come true. I honestly feel that we have a responsibility to dream and to work in order to make the dream come true.
I think that's as good as any point to thank both of our panelists for their participation and to thank all of you for staying with us, and to move it back to Ken for some remarks about the rest of the series. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Hadar. Thank you, Masua. Thank you, Manal, for that bracing and engaging at the same time panel, which frankly sets up very well the next panel, in that if civil society and education are being pointed to as two of the really critical points in the future of shared society, Those are the issues that are being brought up at the next session, section 2 in the series, which will take place next Tuesday, November 15th. And it will be a conversation moderated by Hanan Alexander, our Koret visiting professor in Israel Studies, Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Haifa, in conversation with Sarab Abu Rabia Keder, who's the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion and an Associate Professor of Education at Ben Gurion, and Ayman Agbaria, Associate Professor in the Department of Educational Leadership at Haifa, and also a faculty member at the Mendel School for Educational Leadership in Jerusalem. So please join us. You should be getting those announcements. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to our host. And we look forward to seeing you all soon.